So our speaker today is Mark Christman, and he says that he has an introduction for himself.
Yeah. Hi. Well, thanks everybody. We're talking about PowerShell tonight. My name is Mark Christman, as Chris mentioned. I am an IT infrastructure professional. I've been doing that for 25-ish years for Xerox, Corning, and Conduent, not in that order. The short of that is I'm not a developer. I don't know how to code. I don't code. I do, however, script. And PowerShell is my scripting environment of choice. I'm actually a pretty big fan of PowerShell, though it does have its interesting moments, shall we say. It can be challenging, as with any tool. Anyways, just to help set the stage a little bit, and this being RocDev, I expect most folks here are developers. PowerShell is not a development tool. Not really. You can do development with it if you really want to as an edge case, but don't look at it as a development tool. It's more of a system management tool. The closest analog would be Bash, just from a different direction. So with that, I'm going to go through about 3 phases of this discussion. A little bit of a background. I want to spend most of our time together in demonstration, actually in the environment, talking you through some of the stuff where I've stumbled, neat things that I've found, and how you may want to use PowerShell in your world. And wrap up with some resources if you want to learn more about PowerShell. This is really more of a showroom demo, not anything heavy on the highway. We're not going to get heavy into scripting. This is going to be more command line. So let's jump into it. Background. The project that became PowerShell, or that delivered PowerShell, started in about 2002. And as I understand it, having read the wiki page, the first swing at it was porting Bash. They were actually looking at porting Bash into Windows, which on the surface sounds cool because Bash is awesome. It does really well for Unix, Linux, BSD, but they were having trouble with it in Windows, and they kind of look, it's a different architecture. In Unix, Linux, and BSD, configuration and system management tends to be geared towards ASCII text files. And Bash does really great in that environment. You would think it was almost designed for that environment.
Oh, that is pretty small.
Yes, it is pretty small. Windows, not so much on the text files. There's only one ASCII text file that I know of that's configuration in Windows. That's the host file. And why you would port Bash just to configure that, I don't know. They reset and based their development on .NET Framework and delivered PowerShell. And there have been 6 versions of Windows PowerShell based on the .NET Framework: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 5.1. If you are a Windows 10 user, you probably have Windows PowerShell 5.1 available to you right now. when Windows PowerShell 5.1 is the current and last version that's going to be delivered on the .NET framework. Around about 2016, the decision was made to go cross-platform, and at the same time, open sourcing the tool. PowerShell there's a GitHub repo for it. And they went and leveraged the .NET Core instead of .NET Framework. This started out some compatibility issues with PowerShell Core. 6.0 was delivered in 2018, followed by 6.1 and 6.2. Most recently, with an updated version of .NET Core to resolve some compatibility problems that they were previously having, PowerShell, another rename, 7 was delivered. That was earlier this year, I think January, February, somewhere in that time frame. So the current version is PowerShell 7. It was intended to be the successor for Windows PowerShell and for PowerShell Core, but there remains some compatibility situations that really involve the extensibility modules, so PowerShell modules. And these are created by other groups, third parties, and have heavy dependencies on the .NET framework, and that's where there's that compatibility situation. And I'll show you a little bit of what that looks like as we get into things. So two last points I'm going to talk about in background before I move into demo. PowerShell is intended to be from day one extensible. That really wasn't delivered until version 2. Modules there's a huge amount of modules. There's modules for managing Active Directory, managing Azure, AWS, you name it, there's probably a module for managing it. And again, it's a systems management tool. The other bit of that is PowerShell is object-oriented, which is really great if you're dealing with configuration and you're dealing with systems that have object and complex object data, like Azure Active Directory, those kinds of systems, but not so much if you're dealing with text. So if you need to work with a lot of text, use Bash. If you need to work with objects, PowerShell is a pretty good tool to use. All right, that's the background. Yeah, I kept it short. Cool. All right, let's move on. Before I move, any questions about the background?
I got a question.
Rob has a question. Rob, I can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Is that a microphone in your headset?
Thank you.
Okay.
How's that? Is that better?
Mm-hmm.
See, video does come in handy. Thank you. So I was just curious what version I had, and I went in and I found that I have 5.1. And then how do you launch PowerShell 7? I typed in PWSH and it didn't know what it was. Is this something you have to download or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And you can get that either directly from the GitHub repository. That is not, I don't think that's one of the links I've got in the slide deck. Let me just double check.
I can find it. I was just,
Yeah.
I didn't know if it was supposed to be on my computer already, and it wasn't. So
Yeah, and it's available for a slew of platforms.
okay.
Solaris, Ubuntu, yeah, a lot.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. All right, let's see. Yeah. Next up, and I'm going to apologize. I'm going to share my screen. And I hope I'm sharing my screen, which that's an interesting picture to have picked. The difference between PowerShell 5.1 and 7.0 in launching, if you're just going to launch them directly. So PowerShell 5.1, and I'm going to go out of, I'll be leaving the full screen in a moment. And then PWSH, PowerShell 7. I thought I'd set these up separately. And the way to tell between the two, if you can see this, because I'm sure it's terribly small, and I'll go through this again once I get into the terminal window, is looking at the PS version table. And it'll tell you which version of PowerShell you're running, whether it's 5.1 or 7 or PowerShell Core 6, whichever one you happen to be running. By default, Windows PowerShell will run up in a blue background. PowerShell 7 and the PowerShell Core versions will come up with a black background. Visually, not much different from there. All right, and that's really all I wanted to show here. And I'm going to flip to the terminal window and share that, because this is going to be way more readable. Can everybody read that? Is there any problems reading that?
No problem.
All right. Cool. So, as I showed in probably tiny type, the PS version table, this is a global variable that PowerShell always has populated. It's a hash table, which includes version information, also include the OS that you're running. And I'll show that a little bit more once I get into remoting. I'm going to remote into two different systems a little bit later. All right. Let me make sure I got everything. Yes, I managed to actually show that. One of the PowerShell people that I follow has a recommendation, especially if as you're beginning to learn PowerShell. And there's two things I want to point out here. One is, as you're learning PowerShell, different than another language, instead of starting with scripting, start with how it reacts in the command line, because all a script really boils down to is a complex set of command line instructions. So start with the command line and leveraging it first. And to help you review what's going on, start transcript. Right. This will create a transcript of your entire session in your documents directory at home for Windows. And I'm not sure where it'll land in for other operating systems. I expect it's going to be your home directory. That's by default. You can change that by specifying a path. So if I do a demo of today, 0917.txt, and it's a text file, that's going to give me a transcript started in the D drive. Let's see, what directory am I in? Let me actually do this, get the location. Yeah, get location, that's the actual command line. Let me move up to the D drive. Cd D colon. That might be good. Get location and get child item. And we've got the transcript going right here. Already started. There are some different parameters in start transcript that you can leverage. So if you want to take a look, transcript. There's 3 different sets of parameters you can use. So if you add it, say, to a profile script, you can have the same transcript file used over and over again, or the same daily file used over, and append data for each new session, so that you only have 1 file per day instead of 1 for every session you open up, if you happen to open up multiple sessions every day. You can change which output directory you're in. Yeah. And you can decide whether you're going to include invocation header that's in each, it's in each of the 3 parameter sets. That actually includes a time date stamp for when you set up a command. So whatever it was that you were doing, it'll say when you did it. By default, that's not in play. Let's see. Alrighty. And you might have noticed PowerShell has a commandlet structure, a structure for its commandlets that I've been using. Verb-noun, like start-transcript, verb-noun. And that's intentional. That's something that the team put together to help standardize how commandlets are created. In fact, there is a list of standardized verbs to use. And that's a link that's in the back of my slide deck. So once you get into scripting, or once you get into creating functions and modules, following that guideline will help out in keeping things common. From what I've done most of my career, I look but don't touch so much. Most everything I do is going to be a get. So that's getting information, like get child item. Get child item is just a directory listing, which, oh, by the way, I can also invoke using dir or ls, little shortcut aliases, because we do have aliasing. So you have a set of shortcut aliases that you can use in place of the longer commandlets. I'm going to try and stick with the full commandlets so that you can see what the underlying commandlet really is. What's helped me as I'm going through with PowerShell and leveraging PowerShell is two commandlets, get command and get help. So get command, for instance, I want to know get commands that are going to say DNS. What can I see about DNS off of my machine. So if I'm trying to figure out how to do something in PowerShell and I don't know what the commandlet is, I can use get command and start narrowing in on it. Now, the tool I might actually be looking for isn't a get commandlet. It's actually resolve DNS name. So if I'm a big fan of dig. DNS name, google.com. I can actually come back and get this similar kind of data that I might be looking at using dig. Again, it's a way to find commandlets without having to go searching back and forth on the internet for what they are. And let's see. The two other bits I wanted to show there. What's available to you right now. So list imported is going to tell you all of the commandlets that are available. And my default session has 323 loaded. There's a lot more if you import other modules. The other one is get command module. If I had a specific module in mind that I want to take a look at, Azure AD Preview, for instance. This will tell me which ones are there. I don't actually have Azure AD loaded, but I can look at what commandlets are available in the module before I load it. And that has 283 of them just for Azure AD. Once I've got a commandlet that I think looks right, maybe I need to take a look at it and see what's what. And for this one, I'll just do get command. And how about I do a little bit of more? So if I need to look at what's under the hood for get command, I can take a look at it here. What's the syntax? What parameters do I have? And I mentioned a couple of them, right? Where is it? Module, noun, verb, all great ways to find out what you're looking for to help do the job you're looking to do. Let's see. Get help. Has a lot more parameter sets to it because it's going to do a lot more heavy lifting for you. The other thing with get help is you can actually get the online version of the help, what's published on the internet. So get help online, and that's going to launch a web browser that you can't see and bring up the actual help text in a browser session.
So, Mark?
Yes.
When you're typing, I normally can't see the entire command before you hit enter.
Okay.
Which causes me to ask you, what does that more syntax look like? Are you piping it through more?
I am piping it to more.
Okay.
And one of the other things I'm doing in the commandlets is I have the ability to do tab complete. So if I just type in get HE, hit tab, it'll complete the commandlet for me, which is really great on the enormously long commandlets. If you say, get command, we've got some really, really long ones here, right? I don't want to type that out, and very likely if I try to, I'm going to make a mistake. So using tab complete, especially in the command line setting, but if you're using a scripting environment like VS Code, for instance, which is my scripting environment of choice, tab complete's also available there. Helps reduce those typographical errors. The other bit that I like that is not quite a tab complete, it's control space. So I typed in get-c and control space, and I can go through these various commandlets using the up, down, left, right arrow keys. It will not only tell me, it'll allow me to select one of these commandlets, but it'll also, if there's parameter sets, tell me what parameter sets there are and what I can use. So if I'm looking for something specific that I know has something in the parameter set, I can go find it. That one I love. Just get out of that. So let's get command. Tab complete, control space. And I want to take you back to get alias real quick. So if I want to find what the aliases are for, say, get child item, that was the same as directory. And again, I just tab completed there. I can get all three, yeah, dir, GCI, and ls. Right, so GCI, ls, and dir all give me the same output. If I've got an alias that I don't know what it is, what's a good one to use? CP. We'll actually find out what the definition of that alias is. So say somebody has created a script, it's out on the internet, and I've come up with a line that it just doesn't make sense to me because I don't know what the alias is. I can go find it. This is a very handy tool when trying to understand what somebody else has done, and I'm not. They've taken a couple shortcuts, and I'm not sure what shortcut they did. So for that section, get help, get command, those are the two commandlets that help me out 80% of the time when I'm trying to figure out how to do something. Get alias helps me out when I'm trying to figure out what somebody else has done. and helps me when I'm doing command line work and I just want to be able to do something quicker than typing out something really large. All right, before I move on, any questions about what I just showed you? So that's really, really basic stuff. And two of my favorite commandlets. The next bit I'm going to show you is more of a gotcha bit. Early on in, when you go looking at people's scripts or you go looking at YouTube videos, instructional kinds of things, you're going to see two different ways of putting out output. The most common you're going to see is write host. Right? Hey, it worked. It kind of paused on me. Write host was very common for years. And it's not the greatest thing to use. In fact, if you see it, just assume write output instead. And here's why. Write host is going to write to the current host that you're running the commandlet in. So if you are in a remote session, different machine, and you've got a script that writes host, it's all going to execute on that other machine and you're never going to see it. Write output brings it back into the output pipeline so that you do see it in your terminal window, or it can pipe into a file or whatever else you add into the pipeline. So write host has some value, but in general, if you ever get into putting together a script that's going to return some kind of information back on screen, write output is the first thing you want to do. And there's
Hello.
Is everything all right?
Yes.
everything is perfect. So there's a number of different write commandlets out there. Write output is the workhorse. Once you get into more advanced scripting, writing error, writing debug, verbose warning, these are all more advanced scripting kinds of output so that you can include that as part of your error checking or how your script is put together. Write verbose I've found very useful. But for the most part, write output. Don't use write host. And I did something that I swore I would never do again. I'm a bad man. I used a double quote when I should have used a single quote, or would have been more accurate to use a single quote. Double quote and single quote have different, are interpreted differently by PowerShell. So let's see, let's take a variable. Let's see. So write output this is. So if I include the variable name within double quotes in a write output, what it's going to do is process that variable name. Lovely. Dig it? If I single quote it, it's going to give me exact output. So if I intend to do something very specific, I swore to myself that I would use single quotes. If I intended something to be interpreted, I use double quotes. And where this has bitten me is in looping functions, where I've wanted to get a variable included into something that was being output later. And every single instance of the output had one flavor of that variable, just the last one. So it was interpreted at the very end, and it drove me crazy.
It's a little like what happens in Bash.
Oh,
Yeah, because when you want the thing to process, you use two, and when you want the thing to just take it as a literal, you use one.
I suspect, and I'm not as good with Bash as I would like to be. I suspect there's a lot of concepts that are in PowerShell that were based on what's available in Bash. Because again, Bash is the gold standard as far as
It actually,
shell.
some of it dates back to not to Bash, but the original Bourne shell, because Bash has some features that aren't in Bourne shells. And one of this is features common to both shells, where if you have two or one, some substitution and some processing takes place.
Okay. I didn't know that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I'm going to flip to the big screen again just to show you this one bit. And I'm going to show it to you first and then switch to the big screen so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm just going to do a directory, child item, right? So that. And I'm going to redirect the output to a thing called outGrid view, which is aliased as OGV. Now, because of sharing, you can't see what I just popped up on my screen. Let me flip to this. And I'm going to... Is my screen sharing? Thank you. I'm going to have to keep watching you, Chris, because you're my affirmation. So what this has done is redirected the output into a screen that I can manipulate. So I can filter, I can add filters to this. I can add some criteria to it. So I can add the length. No, that's a filter. Or I can change the sorting. And it gives me a handy way to work with data while I'm trying to figure out what that data really is before I get to an end result. So I don't have to manipulate it on the terminal screen. I don't have to manipulate it in a file. I can do it here and then figure out, okay, this is how I want the output to look. How can I do that with my commandlet, right at the command line? Very useful, especially working with larger data sets. not something you'll do a lot, I expect. And it's also useful when you're working with data sets that are transient. You're just going to look at it the once, poke around, see if you can find the thing you're looking for, and that's the last you're going to look at it. You don't need to save it for anything. So out grid view is another very, very useful useful thing. All right, let me flip back to the terminal window so everybody can actually see what I'm doing. I'm going to show you my profile. Get content, and profile is actually a global variable. So the profile that runs when you start your shell. Bingo, bango. And part of the reason I wanted to show this to you is a technique that I use in my scripts. And this is something I picked up from Don Jones and Jeff Hicks, who wrote some really good books, and I've got references to them later. It's called splatting, taking a hash table to set up as parameters for your commandlet, then just porting this hash table into your commandlet. And let me actually show you the difference. There you. There we go. And what I mean by that. So going back to my notes here, variables and splatting here. I've got my hash table. I'm feeding the parameters into this commandlet. This is effectively the same as this really nasty, gnarly line, except for the stupid quote on the back end that I made a mistake on. In a command line setting, not necessarily that much of a big deal. In a script, I find this way easier for me to be able to troubleshoot. If I've got a mistake in a parameter, I can see what that parameter's value is without trying to find it within some place inside of my command line. This is a technique I adore and I overuse. I probably use it in places where it really doesn't make sense, but I just use it anyways. So that was splatting that I wanted to point out. But we're in variables. Oh, variables. I did mention that PowerShell is an object-oriented scripting language, right?
Yes, yes.
And it understands arrays and hash tables, and the way that they're shown is a little differently. You'll notice here, I've got a curly brace that's offsetting where my hash table is. If I want to do an array, it's a parentheses. So I'm going to show off one of my favorite command lines, one-liners. Let's see. I'll run that a couple times until I actually come up with the opportunity to have ice cream. So the point there is an array is going to be offset by an @ sign and parentheses, where a hash table is an @ sign and curly braces. For me, as not a developer, I banged my head against the wall trying to figure out what a hash table was for probably a year and a half. I'm envious of anyone who didn't have to do that. The other thing with hash tables, let me just grab this. Parameters. There we go. Now you might notice the hash table is coming out in a different order than what it was originally specified in. If instead I added a little bit up front, so, and I don't even remember what to call this, but I'm specifying how that data is going to be set. This is also a way to define what data type your variable is going to be. If I used this formatting for my hash table, it would have come out exactly in the same order that I had entered it in, which has been useful in some of my other scripts where I'm gathering data and spitting it out, but I'm gathering the data and manipulating it into hash tables first before spitting the data out. It drove me nuts trying to figure out how to make sure everything was in the right order until I found that data specification. All right. So I'm at the point in my notes where I'm going to tell you about how I inspect objects, right? Complex objects. I told you about complex objects. PowerShell does that. But I'm going to start off with a compatibility situation with some of these modules. For instance, Azure AD. Module. Okay. If I do this, I'm going to get errors. Let's see. Oh, what's the... What is the parameter? And this is a nice thing about tab complete is I can do it with parameters and find the parameter that I'm looking for, I hope. There we go. Use Windows PowerShell. So if I import this module and use Windows PowerShell, it's not going to error out because it needs the .NET framework. The problem with it is it's going to give me object types in a way that don't necessarily work. So I can connect to Azure AD, and there is a pop-up to get me to log in off to the side. It would help if I moved my mouse to there. And that's my password, and I'm in. Right? And if I get Azure AD user, here's my object. I can actually look at this in a way that gives me more information about it. Converting to JSON, or you can convert it to XML. And that will take and push all kinds of information onto the screen. Boom, 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 boom. But it doesn't look right. I'm not getting the information that I should be getting. And the reason for that, and here's a handy one for you, get member is actually going to tell you about an object or a commandlet, what that data is. So in this case, the object type is a deserialized version of the data, which can happen in remoting situations and happens in this compatibility mode. You're not actually getting that object back. You're getting a version of that object back that may or may not be complete. So let's see. Let me open up Windows PowerShell. Import module Azure Active Directory. That'll help. Do the same thing. I'm going to connect to the same system. That is, if I can manage not to typo 5 times. All right, so I'm back in the same place. And we're going to look at the same user object. Right, same user object. And if I look at the data type on this, it is not that deserialized version, right? The data types are different, but just barely. And if I turn around and convert to JSON there, this gives me much cleaner data to look at. And I can go into licensing and better understand how these structures and how this object is put together. So when I'm looking to create a script to funnel through all of the user objects, I know what to look for in the data that's popping back out at me. or if I'm trying to set up a script that's changing licensing for users. I can do that. But in this case, you're going to need Windows PowerShell to do it. And this is one of the compatibility situations that the PowerShell folks are trying to get past, but haven't yet. And it's really whether the modules become compatible with the newer version of PowerShell. Similar situation for the Active Directory module and the things with the Remote Server Administration Toolkit. But coming back here, this little trick has saved me tons of time going back and forth in data sets, trying to figure out, okay, I'm 2 levels down on an object. Now what? Okay, I can't do that one. What else can I do, right? Using the convert to JSON, using the convert to XML helps out tremendously in this kind of situation. Oh. Ooh. And along the way, you probably have picked up that I'm using command line pipelining. PowerShell does that. I haven't ever run into a situation where I couldn't pipe to the next layer. It can get tricky at times. But one of the things that I will do, and this is where I should have had a, okay, I can do this. Get child item, right? This is the default output for get child item. Select object is a very commonly used next step in a pipeline. So if I were to look at properties and splat, I'm going to get way more information about these directories and files. If I turn around and say expand property, base name, I'm just going to get these base names, and it's a straight string output. So if you're in a situation where you're looking for content and you need string representation, so you're not looking at evaluating a variable, you're not looking at some sort of data type that you're not going to be able to work with later, you just need a string. And where I've used this in the past is enumerating all of the SMTP addresses for a user object. What I'll do is expand the property for the SMTP addresses and throw in a join with using a semicolon. That is a great way to help condense data with PowerShell. Select object is probably one of the more used and useful tools that I have and that you will see used by others in their scripts and others used in their examples. All right. So I've rambled on a lot. We're at 5 after. Chris, how are we doing on time?
I'm muted. So you were guessing about an hour presentation, so spot on, since we started about 5 minutes after.
Okay.
And I haven't seen any questions in channel. Is this a good time to ask for questions? Or
Yeah.
did you have more you wanted to talk about?
I have way more that I can do. I over-prepared. Let me just do a quick run on remoting and then open up to questions and then wrap things up. All right. So the other thing that PowerShell can be very powerful with, no pun intended, or no alliteration intended, is remoting, going into a different system. So, for instance, version. This system, I'm running PowerShell 703. It's a Windows system running 10x. And if I look at the computer name,
Sorry, I'm not sure about that.
and now everybody knows the wake word for my Alexa. Anyways, this computer is named Mustang. If I remote enter PS session, that's the base command for remoting. And with, was it introduced in PowerShell Core 6.2, I believe, was the ability to do SSH-based remoting. Let's see, I don't need to do that. So very much like using SSH or Telnet, I'm now in a separate session. You can see the name of the host that I'm connected to. You'll notice that my prompt is changed to the directory structure because that's the default. I don't have a profile running on that machine. And if I look at the PS version table now, also 7.03, but I'm running on Ubuntu Linux. And it's a different host name. The interesting thing with Linux is if I change over to the environment variables, there's nothing there. So if I exit back out and do the same thing on the system I'm on, my main system, let's see. I have a ton of environment variables. There is a way to do PowerShell remoting over SSH using public key. I apparently am not smart enough to figure out how to set up SSHD for public key authentication.
Mm-hmm.
I am apparently not alone in this. I struggled with that off and on for the better part of a week before I just said, you know what? I can show it this way. But it is possible if you're in a larger environment with disparate systems not connected to an Active Directory domain. using public key authentication can be a way to more easily administer those systems. If you are in a predominantly Windows infrastructure with Active Directory, the WS-MAN based remoting that's been available since Windows PowerShell 2 will allow you to use your current user credential to log in. And if that credential has administrator access on those machines, you should be just fine. All right. There is a number of other things that I didn't get to. I actually got through about half of my notes. PowerShell is a really useful tool. I am a fan. Let me exit out of this. And I'm going to share out the tail end of this presentation. First up, I want to point out some names to know when it comes to PowerShell. Don Jones and Jeff Hicks, these are the folks that I have found most useful. Don Jones is now a VP at Pluralsight. He's been doing educational videos and sessions for years and years. Jeff Hicks is a PowerShell MVP. They did some great collaborations together. And Jeff happens to live in Syracuse. Short plug for Jeff. He is doing an intro to PowerShell session with the New York City PowerShell users group, which is available on Meetup. Next up, if you're looking at more DevOps kind of activity, Adam Bertrand, Adam the Automator, is another great name to look at. I just picked up his book about going from infrastructure to DevOps, because I kind of want to know that. And then folks that I've followed forever and really got me started in PowerShell as an infrastructure professional, Todd Clint pointed out, and this was probably 10 years ago, if you're not planning to learn PowerShell, you're planning to leave the industry. And that is really as an IT pro. There's so much out there that is dependent on knowing PowerShell that it is difficult to avoid using it. You have to try now. So Todd Clint and Shane Young are a couple of great MVPs. All of these folks have YouTube videos that, educational videos. They're all, I'm not sure if Adam's an MVP, but the other four are. So a lot of great material out there from these folks. On references, PowerShell. Oh, I did include the, Rob, there's your link. So the GitHub repository for PowerShell right up here. If you want to see what the approved verbs are. VS Code, my favorite scripting environment. Or, yeah, ISE. Windows Terminal is what I was using. If you haven't seen it yet, it's a newly released capability in Windows. You have to use the Microsoft Store to get it. But it's an open source project, just like PowerShell and VS Code. If you want to explore through modules, the PowerShell gallery. These next three or four, four. These four are books by Don Jones and Jeff Hicks that I have them. They're what I use to learn scripting and more advanced techniques with PowerShell. So if you're a fan of learning through books, these are the first resources that I would point you to. If you prefer YouTube videos, Don Jones has a YouTube channel that has all of the same kind of material that he's done presenting to crowds and throngs of people. And Don and Jeff have both got Pluralsight content. And finally, if you're interested in a history of PowerShell that is more than that little snippet of background that I gave, Don Jones wrote the authoritative book on it called Shell of an Idea. And that is, that's the high level of what I've got. Are there any questions that I can
Where are you posting this?
Where am I posting this? That's a great idea. I hadn't thought of that. I suppose I could put it up in my Git repository. GitHub?
Yeah, they did have for my presentation, the link is what they put on the meetup page, and the link goes into Google.
Okay. Yeah, I can put it just about anywhere.
And George is online now, so he might be able to tell us what the default is for sharing files.
Yeah, usually we go to people's GitHub pages. We'll have the video for this up on YouTube, and then from the description, we'll link to any assets like this.
Okay. Yeah. So, and yes, I do have a GitHub repository. Which has really, really bad examples of scripting, as I've learned over the years. Some better than others. Oh no.
So are there any questions?
No, none. This is a case of once you find out where things are, it gives you about a month or two to play with it.
Yeah. And if you're going to leverage both Windows PowerShell and PowerShell, definitely recommend using the Windows terminal. That way you don't have to do a lot of switching between screens.
Do you commonly use PowerShell to set up infrastructure or just to look at it? And you use it to monitor it?
I have typically used it to inspect, but that's because of what my job function was. There are folks that use PowerShell for configuring, taking infrastructure, especially in things like Azure, and setting up repeatable and verifiable kinds of patterns and using the PowerShell to implement that. That way the change control is around the script rather than the implementation of the asset. Right. So if you need to change what the script's doing, okay, you deal with that change. But if you need to spin up 30 different resources, you don't necessarily, depending on how you're doing things, you don't necessarily have to put a change management in front of that. If you've got a typical development environment that you use, whether it's VMware, whether it's Hyper-V, whether it's in Azure, whether it's in AWS, you can script that out and spin up a new environment very quickly. And for the test labs that I've put up, that's exactly how I did it. Yeah. In fact, for my Microsoft 365 environments that I maintain just to poke around with, putting together the test users for those environments, I did that all with PowerShell.
So you can do some infrastructure as code. Do you know if Terraform generates PowerShell commands? It's an infrastructure as code tool.
I don't know Terraform,
Okay.
so I can't answer that question. I'm aware that a lot of the systems management tools in the Windows OS will generate PowerShell for you. So when you go to, say, add IIS with web and FTP, it will generate that PowerShell for you so that you can repeat it in a number of additional systems without having to go through the GUI.
Well, and you can control it and you can review it before you spin up large amounts of infrastructure.
Right.
I don't know if this helps at all, but I've done very limited PowerShell in Terraform for like provisioning Windows hosts. So sort of like PowerShell that gets executed when the machine is recently provisioned, kind of inversing the paradigm there.
Okay.
And I know that there is a more up-to-date Azure command line that is not PowerShell, but and there is an Azure PowerShell module, so you can go either direction with that. Ooh.
Ansible also has some Windows modules that will execute some remote PowerShell for you.
Yeah, and I've seen some really great uses of PowerShell demonstrated. I know they changed their name, the Rochester Infrastructure Users Group, that was hosted a lot by Paychex. There was a number of presentations that included PowerShell and how they were implementing systems and services. The Azure Users Group that Microsoft hosts, same kind of thing. When they get the highly technical presentations, every time I've seen a technical presentation, it's been with a fair amount of PowerShell and how people are deploying assets and inspecting assets using it. Which, oh, by the way, both great groups. I haven't seen a whole lot from the Rochester Infrastructure Group recently, and the Azure User Group just partnered with Buffalo, and they've done a couple of Zoom presentations. Those tend to be more in the day.
Yeah, the Paychex meetup didn't transition to online.
And that's unfortunate because they had a lot of good content. Though they were also providing dinner, so I don't know how that translated.
Yeah, we can chat about those other meetups in the after chat after the recording.
Are there more questions?
Yeah, we're pretty good here.
Okay, I will find the recording button.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark.